The War of 1812 and other failures to communicate. Tecumseh and the Western Worries. Native Americans in the Northwest and Louisiana territories were determined to hold on to their land. Led by Shawnee Chief Tecumseh, who was supported by Great Britain, several tribes united to fight settlers. William Henry Harrison, governor of Indiana Territory, sent a warning to Tecumseh, urging him to stick to the terms of past agreements. Tecumseh responded that the few chiefs who signed the treaties didn't have authority to represent other tribes and give away their land. The Battle of Tippecanoe. While Tecumseh headed south to convince the Creek Nation tribe to join his forces, Harrison attacked and defeated the Shawnee people near the Tippecanoe River at 1811 at the Battle of Tippecanoe. Tecumseh crossed to Canada to join the British troops. Demands for war. Once again, war with the British seemed inevitable. War hawks, as they were called, were frustrated by the British practice of impressment and determined to acquire new land and more power for their new nation. The British were also inciting American unrest on the frontier. On June 18, 1812, the first time Congress had declared war, the War of 1812 began. That fall, James Madison was elected to his second term as president. The term war hawk refers to anyone in government who supports war. The term peace dove refers to someone who advocates for peace. The War of 1812 begins. The first American plan of attack was to invade Canada, but the British and their Native American allies seized Detroit before the Americans could head north. It was also difficult to invade Canada because the British controlled Lake Erie. Commodore Olivier Hazard Perry, the naval officer in charge of the Lake Erie forces, was ordered to seize the lake from the British. Even after his ship was destroyed, Perry continued to fight. The British eventually surrendered on September 10, 1813, making Perry a national hero and paving the way to invade Canada. After his victory, Perry sent his message to Harrison: "We have met the enemy and they are ours." In October 1813, William Henry Harrison, commanding the troops in the area, defeated the British and their Native American allies near the U.S.-Canadian border. The Battle of the Thames killed both Tecumseh and any alliance with the Creek Nation. Although the Americans had pushed the British out of the area, battles with Native Americans, including the Creek War, continued. In March of 1814, Andrew Jackson, leader of the Tennessee militia, defeated the Creek Nation in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, forcing them to sign the Treaty of Fort Jackson and lose even more land. Attack on Washington, D.C. By 1814, Napoleon had fallen from power and British forces could focus on enemies to the west. On August 24, 1814, the American troops were defeated in the Battle of Bladensburg, which allowed the British to sail into the Chesapeake Bay. They invaded Washington, D.C., setting fire to the Capitol and White House and forcing President Madison to flee. The First Lady, Dolly Madison, stayed behind until the last moment to save a portrait of George Washington. The British continued up the Chesapeake to Baltimore, Maryland, intending to capture Fort McHenry. On September 13th, British warships began their attack, but because of Americans' refusal to surrender, the British Armada eventually withdrew. The Star-Spangled Banner. Before the British attack on Baltimore, Americans raised a large flag over Fort McHenry. When Francis Scott Key, a lawyer who had witnessed the night-long bombardment, saw at dawn that the flag was still there, he was so moved that he wrote a poem to it. The poem was later set to music, and it eventually became the United States national anthem. Capital versus capital. A capital with an A is a city or place that is the official seat of government of a country or state. The U.S. Capitol with an O is a building in Washington with a famous dome and is named after an ancient Roman hill called the Capitoline. The Battle of Lake Champlain and the Battle of New Orleans. In September 1814, British forces trying to seize the city of Plattsburgh, New York, faced the U.S. Navy at Lake Champlain. The Americans refused to surrender in the Battle of Lake Champlain as the British retreated. The British forces in the South decided to attack New Orleans. As they advanced on Louisiana on January 8, 1815, an army organized by Andrew Jackson waited. Marching in their typical style across an open field, the British were easy targets. Winning the Battle of New Orleans boosted Jackson's popularity. It was the final battle of the War of 1812, and it occurred after the war had officially ended. The end of the war. The British decided war wasn't worth the effort and reached an agreement with the Americans, but the news didn't reach Andrew Jackson or the Federalists. From December 15, 1814 to January 5, 1815, Federalists met at the Hartford Convention to show opposition to the war. Little did they know that on December 24, 1814, the British and Americans had signed the Treaty of Ghent in Belgium. The Hartford Convention embarrassed the Federalists for opposing a war that was already won. The Treaty of Ghent did not resolve border and trade disputes between the U.S. and Britain, but it increased patriotism. While the treaty returned the countries to the way things were before the war, Americans were proud to have held their own. Because the War of 1812 cemented America's independence, it is also called America's Second War for Independence. American manufacturers profited, since British goods weren't available. The nation seemed destined for success.